So hi everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. First of all, welcome to our Insider Speaker Series on climate change and California state parks. I'm Emily Doyle. I'm the Climate Resilience Program Manager here at California State Parks Foundation, and we're very excited to have you all here today. So a little bit about California State Parks Foundation. We are a member-supported nonprofit, and our mission is really to protect and preserve California state parks for future generations. And this ranges from, hosting volunteer events all the way up to affecting change at the policy level. And another really critical thing that we focus on is educating the public and our members about critical issues facing state parks. And one of those, I'm sure people here will agree, is climate change. So that's why we're all here to learn more about it today. So to get started, I'm just going to go over some logistics. Everyone is going to be muted throughout the webinar, but we're going to be using the Q&A function, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. And feel free to enter any questions you have throughout the presentations, and we'll be collecting those to answer in a Q&A session at the end. And lastly, we just ask that people are respectful to our speakers and to each other throughout the webinar. So here's an outline of what you'll hear over the next hour. I'm going to begin by giving a brief overview of climate change and a couple ways that it's impacting California state parks before we have our two speakers who are going to specifically speak to sea level rise and wildfire. And then we'll move into some questions and audience Q&A before finishing up the hour at 1 o'clock. So now let me introduce our speakers. First, we have Dr. Gary Griggs, who is a distinguished professor of earth sciences at UCSC, and he's one of California's leading authorities on sea level rise. His research focuses on California's coastal zone, including the impacts of sea level rise on beaches and the coastline, as well as policies to reduce the impacts of coastal hazards. And Dr. Griggs has served on the science advisory team to the Ocean Protection Council since 2008, and was also a key contributor to the Cornerstone Report, Rising Seas in California, an update on sea level rise science. And that was just a couple of mini accolades I could have chosen from. And second, we have Danny McCamish, who is a Natural Resource Program Supervisor and Senior Environmental Scientist for California State Parks, Colorado Desert District. It's a mouthful. And Danny has over 15 years of experience in natural resource management and climate change research. And he is also the program supervisor of the Native American Conservation Corps program at Cuyamaca Rancho State Park, which provides local Native American youth with work experience in wildfire resilience work, as well as cultural education, which he'll be speaking more about later on. So I'm really looking forward to learning more about their work. But before that, as I said, I just want to touch on two other impacts of climate change that are affecting parks and where parks can really play an important role. A little bit about my background. I'm a California native. I grew up in Santa Cruz, and I have a PhD in earth science from the University of Cambridge, where I focused on polar and global climate systems before joining California State Parks Foundation last year. And I was really excited to be able to take my research background and bring it back to help protect the parks that I visited every year when I was a kid. So I'm also very excited to be with you. And now let's learn some more about climate change in state parks. Excuse me. So as we know, California is already seeing the effects of climate change across the state. And two of these impacts are extreme heat events and decreasing biodiversity. So compared to the first half of the century, the average temperature in California has already increased by 1 degree Fahrenheit, and in some places by more than 2 degrees. And by the end of the century, at the rate that we're going, temperatures could actually increase an additional 9 degrees Fahrenheit across the state. And that actually means that the average annual temperature could be over 80 degrees by 2100. And in addition to this general overall increase, there's also going to be an increase in the frequency and temperature of extreme heat events. So again, by the end of the century, these events, the average temperature could exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And on the right-hand side, you can see a map of how those events could be distributed throughout the state. And these will have really significant impacts on public health. And that is particularly for communities who don't have the resources to take the necessary precautions. For example, people who can't afford air conditioning. And this is where California State Park can play a really important role by providing a cool place for people to escape the heat, as well as necessary resources like water or even a place to charge your phone. And so increasing park resilience and really, really importantly, ensuring equitable access to these spaces is absolutely critical. And California State Parks are really rising to meet this challenge. The other impact that I wanted to touch on is the effect of climate change on biodiversity. So prolonged drought, decreased snowpack, the increased spread of disease and pathogens, habitat loss, all of these impacts are coming together to lead to a rapid loss in California's extraordinary biodiversity. And California is actually designated as one of 36 global biodiversity hotspots, but native species have already declined 20%, and over 400 species are threatened or endangered. And we can expect that number to increase. And California state parks are actually a refuge for many of these species. On the screen, you can see several of California's iconic species that call state parks home. We have the giant sequoia redwoods at Calaveras Big Tree State Park, western monarch butterflies that spend the winter at parks up and down the California coast, the threatened California red-legged frog, and the snowy plover, which is a seabird that nests at about 60 state parks on the California coast. And we're actually going to be having an entire webinar on biodiversity later this year. So you can learn more about this topic, and we really hope you join us for that. But today, as I said, we're going to delve a little more into sea level rise and wildfire and why they're so important that parks address these threats. So first of all, state parks make up almost a quarter of the California coastline. So not only are they at kind of the front line of this climate threat, but they can also have a large impact on California's preparation and resilience and sea level rise overall. On the right-hand side, you can see a walking path that had to be redesigned and rebuilt because of increased shoreline erosion due to sea level rise. Parks are also facing extreme and sometimes irreparable damage from wildfires. So in recent years, we've been seeing an unprecedented increase in the frequency, severity, and size of these fires. And this is because of climate change and also due to 150 years of fire suppression, which began after the banning of Native American burning practices that until then had maintained healthy landscapes for centuries. And as a result, we've been left with dense forests that are choked with dry, highly flammable fuel that are leading to these increasingly catastrophic fires. In 2020, it was the worst wildfire season in California's recorded history. Almost 4% of the entire state burned, and this included 97% of Big Basin Redwood State Park, the oldest state park in California. You can see on the left the before and after picture of the historic visitor center that was completely destroyed. And climate projections actually show that by 2100, the average amount of land in California that could be burned every year can increase by 77%, with some projections estimating as high as 178%, which would have drastic impacts on state parks in California overall. And the key to really reducing this risk of wildfire is reducing the fuel availability. And this includes both clearing out dead trees and other fuel, and importantly, returning fire to the land, for example, through prescribed burns or the reintroduction of cultural burning. And these are just two examples that show that parks are really already feeling the impacts of these climate threats, and why the expertise of our next speakers is so invaluable. So without further delay, let me pass it over to our first speaker, Dr. Gary Griggs. I'm looking forward to learning more about his work in sea level rise. So take it away.
Thank you, Emily. And thank you all for being part of this today. And if I had to pick one slide to summarize my talk, it would be this one. It combines short-term sea level rise and a state beach right on the shoreline and the kind of damage that occurred in January. There's really two different kinds of environments, whether it's, public infrastructure, parks, or private property that are going to be affected by future sea level rise. One is low-lying areas where they're going to be flooded more frequently, that'll last longer and extend further inland in the future. And the second are cliffs and bluffs where higher the sea level, waves are going to come further up the coastline and attack those cliffs and bluffs and lead to future erosion at a higher rate. This is just a quick summary of the last, say, 20,000 years of sea level rise to give you some perspective. And when the last ice age ended about 20,000 years ago, ice melted, ocean water warmed, and sea level rose from about 18,000 to 10,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago. It rose at about a half an inch a year. But there were some periods within that where it rose in sort of these leaps and maybe an inch a year. And we believe those are now connected to ice sheet collapse in Antarctica, which we're very concerned about today. Difficult to predict. And then about 8,000 years ago to maybe the late 1800s, sea level rose at a very, very slow rate, maybe less than a millimeter per year. And that happens to correspond to the entire period of human civilization. We have never had to deal with sea level rise before. At the present time, over the last decade, it's been rising at about 14 inches per 100 years, but that curved line is showing it's accelerating, and what we don't know is how high it will be at what point in the future. And I will say sort of boldly that that may be the biggest challenge human civilization has ever had to face. We've been recording sea level rise locally at tide gauge stations around the world for a little over 150 years. And this is a water level recorder at the Golden Gate. And it shows an average of about 8 inches per 100 years. But these tide gauges record local sea level. It's what the ocean is doing relative to the land. So the land could be rising or sinking or level. So it's a local value. We, in 1993, kind of went beyond that, and we launched satellites, a couple to begin with, and we've added more that actually are measuring sea level globally very precisely from space. And we know it's average now about 14 inches per 100 years, but it's accelerating. And over the last decade, that's up to almost 20 inches per 100 years. What's the potential problem out there? If we melted all the rest of the ice on the planet, Greenland, Antarctica, and the mountain glaciers, we could raise sea level about 216 feet. And I would ask all of you, are you living within 216 feet of sea level? Nobody thinks this is going to happen this year or this century or next century. This is the potential, but we don't need 216 feet. 3, 4, 5 feet is going to create crisis around the world because most of our really big cities are on the coast, close to sea level. In addition to this long-term sort of gradual challenge of this slow, gradual rate, we've got these short-term events. And what this is showing is the San Francisco tide gauge, and those 3 red arrows correspond to El Nino events. You might remember 1941. Well, you don't remember 1941. 1982, 83, 1997, 98. So we can raise sea level actually a foot or 2 above normal for several months, which really accelerates this short-term impact. If we look at the state park, state beach system, we've got about 128 of those along the coast that are going to be exposed to both long-term sea level rise and also short-term extreme events. And as an example of short-term events, this is the city of Capitola, which isn't a state park, but this is a typical summer day, and that can change rapidly in the winter months when high tides, large waves come in over the shoreline, erode the beach, and come into downtown, which happened in 1983, happened in 2023, happens actually quite frequently. Parks like Wilder Ranch, just on the edge of Santa Cruz here, is pretty much undeveloped. There's an old center of farm buildings, but the activities that most people take part in, biking, hiking out along the bluff, are of no real danger to future sea level rise because it's pretty much undeveloped. Sea Cliff, on the other hand, was developed well out on the beach. You can see the coastal bluff in the background. That's where the waves used to come, but we built out a developed park for RV parking, for picnicking. And that timber bulkhead that supports that parking area has a long history of development, damage, and then reconstruction. And this is sort of encapsulates that, shows you where it is. But coming down the vertical axis, we go back to 1926 all the way to 2023. Each of those solid lines is when a timber bulkhead or seawall was built. And the dashed line below that is when it was destroyed or damaged. So this has happened now 8 times. Each time the wall is built and essentially are rebuilt in exactly the same way. At a low tide today, this happens to be 2010, you can actually see the remains on the right side of a steel sheet pile that held a concrete wall back in 1926, was destroyed the next winter, and one that was built in 1931 that was destroyed soon afterwards. So this is a recurring problem. After the storms in the early 80s, a new timber bulkhead was built in November 1982 that was predicated on lasting 20 years in terms of the economics. About 6 weeks later, the big El Nino of January 83 hit, destroyed half of that just completed wall, took out all the fill and the improved areas behind it. So it lasted 6 weeks instead of 20 years. Following that, the 7th reconstruction, which was done in 1984, this is a picture from 2012. They actually built a slight improvement. They put these boards on the outside of these pilings. They made them 2x3 instead of 2x12. I'm sorry, 3x12. So they were a little thicker. And those were called sacrificial bumper boards. And that was going to sort of deflect and protect the wall from the logs and debris that come down here during winter storms and then batter the wall. This is now January 23. That new resistant wall actually lasted almost 20 years, actually almost 40 years, from 1984 to 2023. Same wall was destroyed in the same fashion. So we essentially destroyed the RV area, most of the parking area. And the question is, what do we do next year? Do we rebuild this the same way? Do we try something different? Do we move back? Do we relocate? And there's a study now underway by state parks, by a consultant on what do we do next. Any place along the coast, we actually have 3 options. We can put more sand on the beach. We can build walls, revetments, seawalls, or we can relocate. And we can either do planned relocation or unplanned relocation. Nourishment is not done very much in California. There's been a few projects in San Diego where we put in about 3.5 million cubic yards, 2 different occasions, cost 46 million. Most of that was gone in 1 to 2 years. So very expensive, very short-lived. I don't think we're going to do any of that in front of state parks. If we look at armor along the coast, for the coast as a whole, about 14% of California has been armored. Southern California, 4 southernmost counties, about 38% has been armored with all kinds of things. This is pretty much the end of an era because the Coastal Commission is enforcing their sort of guidance on no more new structures. There may be a few, but I think we're not going to have any more of this. And then we can go to managed or unmanaged retreat. And this is Gleason Beach on the Sonoma County coast, where there was a whole series of homes built right on the bluff, right next to State Highway 1, and a very erodible bluff. So in recent years, most of those houses have gone into the water. The road is now being threatened. So Caltrans and Coastal Commission finally came up with a relocation plan and just has finished moving that wall inland, or moving the road inland, at a cost of about $70 million. So we may see more and more of that in the future. And we have some projections on where sea level might be in the future, which are important to keep in mind for any coastal structure. And you can see by 2050, sea level could be a foot or 2 higher, a little more confidence, but by the time we get out to 2100, these different colors are based on different greenhouse gas emission scenarios. So it could be 2 or 3 feet, it could be 8 or 10 feet. And those are big differences. The study Emily mentioned when we started was done in 2017 that put a perspective on what we know about sea level rise, what we don't know, where we might be in the future. And then in 2018, that was followed up with a guidance document. Right now, there's a 5-year update by a task force that I'm part of that's going to be finished probably within a month on the newest guidelines where we might look to the future. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Griggs. That was an amazing presentation. I'm looking forward to learning even more during the Q&A session. And now let me introduce our next speaker. There we go. Danny McCamish from the Colorado Desert District of State Parks, who's going to tell us more about wildfire resilience. So go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Dan McCamish. I'm the Senior Environmental Scientist, the Natural Resources Program Manager for the Colorado Desert District of California State Parks. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a unique fire management program that we have within our district and how we built that with some of our local tribal collaboration. Emily did a great job introducing some of those fire management goals that not only in the state but regionally we have. The ideas of returning Native Americans to their homelands, the ideas of putting Native American fire practices back into effect, and that's really what I want to talk to you a little bit about today. So with that, when I say the term, or when Emily has said the term, the Colorado Desert District is a state park district that encompasses 3 major areas of mostly San Diego County, Imperial County, and Riverside County also. We have in that area, we have the Anza Borrego Desert State Park, Cuyamaca Rancho State Park, and Palomar Mountain State Park, to total about 750,000 acres. In our district here, we are the largest district in California State Parks, managing this public land that is approximately the size of Delaware. With that, we're a unique area also in that San Diego County just alone has 18 federally recognized tribes that share a historic homeland and share boundaries with one of the parks that we manage. And this doesn't include the other non-federally recognized tribes or tribes that are in Riverside and Imperial County that also share land with Anza Borrego. So while we're talking about this, we do, as you can see across this map here, we do a lot of land management. And one of the major things that we do is fire management. So with that, we came up with what we thought was a really novel idea, which was a Native American conservation crew. And with this, we wanted to partner with our local tribes, some of those people that surround us that historically have been taken away from their native homelands. We wanted to be able to return them to their traditional homelands and gain a workforce for wildfire and fuel reduction training. We wanted to train local youths on skill set and on-the-job training. And also, we wanted to give them some traditional tribal and Native American education while they worked back in their homelands. The goal with this training process, this team building, would to take these youth and they would be able to return back to their tribal areas and have that skill set as a firefighter. I'll take this time also to talk about some of our partners. This is a major undertaking, what we tried to kind of turn around in a series of about a year or two. The Native American Conservation Corps logo you see there, and we allowed our youth team members to develop some of this. Also, California State Parks has been supporting us along the way. The Resources Conservation District of Greater San Diego worked with us to help manage some of our financials. The San Diego River Conservancy was seed money to get a lot of this started, and then the Kumeyaay de Guenya Land Conservancy helped us recruit as we began this process. A Native American conservation crew targeted at Native American youth seems like maybe a new idea, or maybe that has been going around others, but we had been bantying this idea around for a while. And just to give you an idea on this time frame, not only did this idea take a while to pan out, but we had 5 or 6 years plus all the years prior to that of building these Native American relationships with our local tribe members and our local representatives. We would get together. We would invite them to different things. We would invite them to visitor services for the state parks, to have them come and give cultural education lessons. Here in this picture, you see recreation of Kumeya'iwa hut or village living situation, which we, permitted them to collect these native reeds on our parkland and then reconstruct what a seasonal village would have looked like. And as we did this, as we got together with these team members, as we got together with Cuyamaca College and other Native American educators, all of these ideas begin to move into place. And as we set and we built some of these different cabins together, we built this longhouse together as visitor services and interpretive places. These ideas really came through from both the Native American and the state park side. In case you couldn't tell from our map, we are extremely remote out here in the Colorado Desert District, Anza Borrego, Cuyamaca, and Palomar. So accessing a skilled workforce or training a skilled workforce in wildfire and wildland fire prevention training, SAL training, team safety training, all of these are really important. And the tribe wanted to be able to come back to the lands that were traditionally theirs. They wanted youths to be able to get off the reservation and get a skill set training outside of maybe their area, and then come back with that skill set that they could use to ultimately protect their own land and build their own wildfire protection teams. The same thing is happening within our Colorado Desert District. You can see in this picture, we have loads and loads and loads of fuel. Your forests likely look like this too. And this is an image. You could see some of the effort that these team was going through to reduce fuel loads amongst our forest lands. But the state park, we really needed this collaboration too. As I said, this local recruitment, this fuel reduction labor, 750,000 acres that need fuel reduced is a lot in the state park system. But we also had a lot of these shared stewardship goals. And ultimately, we wanted to be that partner that helped tribes return. We put all these ideas together, and within the course of about a year, we developed these actionable items. I had a couple of really awesome team members that took these ideas and ran with them. But we had to set partner roles. We had to develop recruitment. We had to develop flyers. All of these different things along the way. We had to come up with training processes. We had to find funds to buy fire protective equipment, like the yellows that you may see some of them wearing here. So all of this took a ton of time, and ultimately, did we have that time? Not really, but we thought it was such a good idea that we needed to kind of run with it anyway. So in 2022, we began a pilot year with this. We recruited 7 to 8 team members at the time from local and adjacent tribes to Cuyamaca Rancho State Park, and we tried to mimic a Conservation Corps framework. We wanted to have them come and camp out and sleep and live where they were going to work over the next months and weeks. And we began to teach them both our methods of learning wildfire reduction, like you see here in this pile burning as a method. We also gave them the wildland firefighter training. We gave them SAL training. And then we also worked with Cuyamaca College to bring in educators that would teach traditional tribal knowledge, traditional tribal things like, as an example, basket making or food preparation. These were integrated into the situation where they learned to work and also learned about their tribal traditions along the way. Ultimately, it was a successful 2022. You see them working here doing pile burns. You see on the left image of them training, not in the wildlands there. They're learning how to do hose pulls, etc. But ultimately, we were able to graduate about 7 team members this year, and we were able to return money for the upcoming season. And we had a lot of lessons learned. But the good news is we were able to continue this moving on. Here you see some of that reed gathering. Here again, you see fuel loads as these teams were working to cut up and pile and burn these fuel loads. The ongoing benefits, of course, as I said, we finished 2022 in a successful year. No one injured, no one, of course, loss of limb or life, which was always a success. And we came out of it with lots of lessons learned. We also continued to find funding for the next 3 or 4 years, which was great and shows back to the Native American teams that we are continuing to promise this training and collaboration. Recently, we've already had CAL FIRE collaboration with this locally. We are expanding our target areas based on different grantors. We're growing our education opportunities, bringing in extra people to teach different skill sets or different historic cultural management. And we're growing our communications. We've recently had a Native American educational gathering in Palomar where they invited multiple tribes and multiple agencies from all around the state to come here and begin the discussion about how do we return Native American traditional tribal burning cycles to our landscape. And then I will go back. Everything has been a fantastic learning experience, has been a fantastic growth together. And I just want to point back to this point. It was 5 to 6 to 7 years of this communication before we could even get to a point where I think trust was built between our state park region and some of these tribal relations, and having these discussions, having this community, having these agencies that have supported us along the way have been a really big part of us being able to build our workforce and build our collaboration. So if that is it, that is it. So I will turn it back over to him. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Danny. Sounds like an amazing program. And so before we move into the Q&A, I also just wanted to take this moment to share some about the work that California State Parks Foundation has been doing for climate resilience. So last year, we provided over $138,000 in grants to 9 different grantees to help increase wildfire resilience in California state parks. And we just received progress reports on these projects. So I wanted to share a couple of those with you today about the great work that's being done. So one grantee is the Crystal Cove Conservancy, who does work at Crystal Cove State Park. And with our support, they were able to offer a fire ecology internship program to 12 high schoolers, where they were able to learn about the history of fire in California, including as well as its relationship to climate change, human activity, how it affects the landscape and ecological systems. And they also worked with natural resource experts in the field and were able to visit recent burn sites, which I believe is what the photo on the left shows. And by the end of the program, some expressed interest in pursuing environmental careers. So perhaps we even inspired a new generation of park supporters. The second one that I was going to tell you about was a grant to the Gold Discovery Park Association, who does work at Marshall Gold Discovery State Park. And this park has been threatened by multiple fires in recent years, and it has an extensive buildup of excess fuel, particularly around historic structures. And clearing out this fuel is complicated by the fact that some of these trees are over 100 years old and have their own historic value. So you can't just go in and remove things without extreme planning ahead of time. And so with our funding, they were able to hire a certified arborist who can complete this work to ensure that they were increasing wildfire resilience as much as possible, while also maintaining the historic nature of the park. And in these images, you can see the before and after of where they removed a large overhanging tree that was threatening the historic blacksmith shop, which you can see here. And this is just some of the work that California State Parks Foundation is doing. I would love to be able to share the work that all of our grantees have done. We're very proud to support them all. Unfortunately, I don't have time right now, but they've all been amazing. So now we're going to move into a Q&A session. And before that, I just have a couple questions that I was particularly really interested in that I would like to ask. So first to Dr. Griggs, how many how do park managers balance responding to long-term sea level rise versus short-term adaptation measures, such as what's necessary like for El Nino events?
That gets right to the heart of the issue. Thanks, Emily. I think there's two issues that we have to deal with, or state park managers have to deal with. One is short-term, one is long-term. And this last winter, January, mostly was short-term. We had really large waves coming simultaneously with very high tides and strong onshore winds. And places like Sea Cliff were heavily damaged. I'd say that's going to be the biggest challenge till at least mid-century and probably beyond, because our sea level rise rate is still, pretty low. Ultimately, those two are going to be working together, and we're going to have to think longer term. The other issue is how do we balance those sort of risks and costs, like at Sea Cliff, which I will say the answer in the past is let's just rebuild it because the people want to come. So we've got the issue of public use, whether it's RVs or picnicking or whatever, and what does it take to maintain that? And I think particularly at Sea Cliff, we need to look back and say, okay, this wall's been destroyed 7 times or 8 times. We don't want to rebuild that the same way. That's not a good use of public funds. And this is the time to sort of reevaluate what's possible. There is a parking area that could be used for RVs and public up on the beach or up on the bluff with stairways down to the coast. So that's one thing. And we keep using this word resilient, but I think in some people's case, that means you just build it back the same way it was. That's not the way I think we need to think of resilient. We think of how can we still maintain public access, but not put more stuff in, more improvements in harm's way.
Okay, great. I also had a question for Danny. The great work that you guys are doing in the Colorado Deserts District, what is how could that be expanded statewide to a more statewide wildfire resilience program?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Emily. That's a great question. Also, we in talking about this in the state and reaching out to all of our collaborators, this was a question that was posed to us a lot. How is there a way to make this a state entity, a state program? And I think the answer, of course, would be it's super nuanced in dealing with each different tribe and the tribal relations. I think there could be thematic elements like setting up ideas of like infrastructure to vehicles or PPE, chainsaws, that type of thing. But then the interaction with each tribe is so unique, and the story that they want to tell or the education that they want to provide, or in converse, the landscape itself will be different across the state. So each one would require probably its own education and training build as you went regionally, whereas from an infrastructure side, maybe that could be approached from a state entity. But I think every region would have to work out some communication and understanding between their local and regional goals. So
Okay, we have a question from the audience that kind of follows up on that I think is really interesting. They're asking how many of the Native tribes in San Diego County had memories of Native American fire practices?
So quite a few. This is what I, hinting at with this years of conversation that we've been having. We still learn things every time we gather more people together. Just recently, as I said, I mentioned we went to Palomar Mountain State Park with a large group of multiple tribes from the region, along with different agencies, federal and state, to kind of get together and have these discussions. And there are still people that have, from their past, the last 100 years here in San Diego County, have it in their family stories and have it still practicing up until very recently. They would ignite their areas under their belief system and underneath their management system up until very recently. It is still not only in communicatively stories of the past. There are people who could tell you that they did it up until a few years ago. So at least here in San Diego County, the desire is readily apparent amongst the tribes, and that was a big thing that we got out of our meeting the other day. This is the question of, we've been having this conversation and we've been teaching them our method, which of course we have all sorts of laws and everything surrounding that, and they want to know when they can come and introduce their method to us. So we're still working on that, but it is very recent in their memory.
Wow. Okay. It's just amazing thinking of all this knowledge that these groups have that they can help bring that we can benefit from. That's great to hear. I have some questions. Here's one for Gary. How does sea level rise affect Bay Area wetlands?
Well, San Francisco Bay Area or wetlands we're thinking, I guess, huh?
Sorry?
San Francisco Bay Area wetlands,
yes.
Is that we're thinking? Yeah. Yes. We've done a lot of work trying to restore wetlands and so forth in the Bay Area. A lot of money has been spent trying to bring back what they were like. The problem is around San Francisco Bay is the edges are all developed, except when you get up into the North Bay, Sassoon Bay, and so forth. So around the South Bay, with development, at some point, sea level is going to come right up to that seawall or that revetment. It's the San Francisco Airport, the Oakland Airport, the Alameda Naval Air Station, and it can't go any further. So eventually we're going to drown all those marshes and wetlands. So they're not going to survive for a long time because of sea level rise. As you get up in the North Bay, I mean, sort of Petaluma, that area, they were going to survive longer because there's more place for them to move inland. But where there's a barrier, a back barrier, they're not going to survive. They can only grow so high, and then they're going to be flooded.
Is that when basically strategic retreat or is kind of the only option?
Yes.
Yeah.
In my view, unless you want to take out places like East Palo Alto and all the other communities around the South Bay. And that's the problem. We've got definitely conflicting interests.
Yeah, for sure. Here's another question that kind of builds off of that as well. Is someone saying that they've seen a lot of the impacts of sea level rise along the central and southern coast, and is sea level rise affecting Northern California as well, and how?
So I actually answered that online, but yes, the sea level is rising along the whole coast. The most important things are what the local rate is, and it doesn't vary that much along the entire coast of California. But the big difference is, and it's going to be the same two things, low-lying areas, the roads, say, but near Eureka is right along a slough that gets flooded now. So low-lying areas will be flooded more frequently. Coastal cliffs and bluffs are going to erode more rapidly. The big difference with Southern California, Northern California is the level of development. So once you get to Ventura, Santa Barbara, Los Angeles, San Diego, Orange, those bluffs and shorelines are completely developed. The property has some of the most, the highest values. Think of Malibu, any place in the country. The North Coast, I mean, we do have Fort Bragg and Mendocino and Crescent City and Eureka, but mostly undeveloped coast. So I think the hazards are the same, but the risks are much lower because there just isn't as much exposed to future sea level rise.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense that it's regional. Let's see, we have some others from the audience as well. Let's see, Danny, here's one for you. Are there other benefits of cultural burning and returning fire to the land in addition to increasing wildfire resilience?
Yeah, absolutely. I think everything's nuanced in our land management discussion, right? And we have a mixed mosaic is maybe a best way to put it. The 750,000 acres, even when we divide it into parks, it's not going to be the same across each region. And then also cultural heritage sites are not going to be the same across each region. For example, meadows or wet meadows up in Cuyamaca and Palomar are montane elevated meadows. Those are not only a cultural site,
You just hit the mute button.
Was I muted that whole time?
Just when you said cultural site, not very long.
Uh-oh. Did I lose it? Can you still hear me?
Yeah. Can you turn up the volume at all? You're a little soft.
I've lost you, Emily.
Uh-oh.
I'm going to,
there we go.
Audio's coming back in. There we go.
There we go.
I don't know if that was me or everybody else. So
the joys of Zoom. No worries.
I don't know where I cut out at. Meadows, wet meadows, as an example, is an area that we might not target for regular fuel reduction. It's not what we would call a forested area, of course, but the meadow itself is a water cycler, a carbon generator. It's a habitat for lots of other things. But historically, those meadows were also cultural sites for food processing and living and all of the other things that went along with that lifestyle. So we look at maybe doing some things that might be outside of what we would consider forest management, but it is also fuels management. Our meadows, our grasslands burn in the same manner. Also, many of our meadow plants, as an example, evolved with fire in their ecosystem. So native systems like bunch grass or deer grass, which would be native to these areas, compared to the many other grasses that have come over from European colonialism along the way, burning out some of these non-native grasses and being able to replant, that gives the meadow benefit. It gives the cultural benefit of being able to clean and return to some of their native homelands. And then lastly, that habitat is always benefited when we can remove non-native plants and put native plants back in. And that's another part. It's connecting people back to the environment, not just, of course, you saw in those images, heavy fuel logging, or I say logging, heavy fuel reduction, cutting up big timber that had fallen or burned and died previously. But yeah, there's lots of other fire effects that evolved in Southern California, from the meadows to the riparian system, to the food processing, to the development of reeds for, again, basket making and that type of thing. Fire as in our toolbox for land management can develop in all sorts of different ways, not just reducing specifically a wooded fuel load. I hope that helped.
Yes. There's another question here on wildfire, particularly burning, which I also get asked relatively frequently. So I'm very interested in hearing your answer, which is they're asking, is there a more environmentally friendly way, since burning releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere?
Sure, we look at all sorts of methods. I think most people, when they hear prescribed burning, they think of a broadcast burn, large acres being burned in one fell swoop or something like that. But we look at other methods also. The realism about this is anything that we're doing, whether we're reducing fuel in one method by burning it, or we're chipping it up and taking it to a biodegrade facility, which is also one of the options we use. It's going to use some type of fossil fuel along the way. We're going to have to use some type of power or motorized engine in order to move or transport some of this stuff. The goal for us is we believe that our fuel is overloaded, as Emily alluded to earlier. 150 years of fire suppression in an ecosystem which developed with fire. We have too much fuel right now, and we're trying to reduce that fuel load so that when fire comes back into that ecosystem, it is less devastating. It reacts more commonly or normal. We don't have extreme wildfire behavior. But the goal, of course, is to remove that fuel load. So if we were to chip it up and put it back into the ecosystem without, burning it or taking it somewhere else for decomposition, then it doesn't really reduce how much fuel is there. Even if we were to chip it up and pile it, it would still produce energy. So with all that, there are other methods that we use. Not all of them are the best. Burning, of course, does release that CO2 in the atmosphere. We have other things that we call like incinerators that reduce the volatile organic compounds that go out into the air. The idea is that we burn wood in a very hot and closed environment so that it actually becomes there's less dirty of a burn. The wood pile would eviscerate more cleanly so that there is less smoldering CO2 over time, or carbon monoxide, which also comes out of those fires. But very, very simply, the real answer, we do try to balance it, but burning fires is the best known way at this method to get rid of this fuel load before our fuel loads can be into a safe level.
Okay, thank you for that. A question here for Gary. What are some solutions for managing sea level rise from other states or organizations or countries that are effective and that might work in California? And what we can we learn from that?
Actually, I just answered that, but that was just for one person, I think. So I gave that list at the end. Where do we go from here? And there's basically one I didn't put in there, which is denial or do nothing. And there's some, I'm going to call them conservative states in the other part of the country, Florida, for example, where they're still trying to figure out if sea level is occurring, even though they're getting flooded with every hurricane. So there's denial, there's armor, there's sand, there's the words managed retreat have not been well accepted for maybe obvious reasons. So we're talking about managed relocation, stepping back gracefully, realignment, other words for what we have to do in the end. There's absolutely nothing we can do over the long run to hold back the Pacific Ocean. And so there's lots of things that get thrown out all the time. And it's usually a company trying to make money on some new device they can put in that looks like it's going to work. But I had a colleague for years at Berkeley, a brilliant coastal engineer. And every time I'd come up with some new idea, he'd say, Gary, for every complicated problem, there's always a simple answer, and it's always wrong. So I think accepting the rate of sea level rise, accepting the fact that our carbon emissions are still increasing every year, we have locked in at least a century or more of sea level rise, probably at an accelerating rate. So there's just a limited number of things we can do. A lot of talk now about living shorelines. What does that really mean? You know, coral reefs are living shorelines, mangroves. We don't have those in California. We don't have many of those in the US except for Hawaii. So sure, we can plant things in the dunes where they already exist. But when you look at a rocky coast like the one behind me in Santa Cruz, there's nothing living you can put there. Right now it's been rock. So what we're going to probably do is start to move back gradually. So we got to face the reality of what's coming, as hard as that is.
Yeah, that makes sense. Here's one where we're almost out of time for questions, but I think either of you could be directed at either of you, so feel free to jump in. What kind of data collection is happening in the parks so that a plan can be made to address climate issues as they worsen?
I'll start. Part of what we do in the natural resources program here is not only do we do projects like trail monitoring or wildfire reduction, that type of thing. We do a lot of ecological monitoring across the region. We partner with different school systems, different researchers along the way, and we also, again, do historic monitoring of different areas. We generally have the parks divided up into management units, and within those management units, we do historic monitoring at plots, and we use that data to inform our management decisions over time. Sometimes, specifically, we look at really deep dives in fragile ecosystems. Currently in Anza Borrego Desert State Park, we're working on our marsh and waterway systems. A lot of people don't think in the desert that we would have waterways or rivers or creeks or marshes. And we have cienagas and that type of thing. And all of those are drying up right now, speaking of climate change. So we're doing a focus study right now on these, I guess, really sensitive and hyper affected ecosystem types so that we can not only track change over time, but maybe find answers into how to manage the land as it changes.
Gary, I would love to hear your answer as well, but unfortunately we are out of time.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you again to both of you for joining us today. We're now going to put up a poll that we would love if you guys could take a second to answer, just so we can learn more about what topics you'd be interested in hearing more about. The recording of the webinar will be sent out, as well as a survey. So we would appreciate if you could provide feedback on that, so we make sure that we continue to refine these events so that everyone gets the most out of them as they possibly can. We'll also we'll try to answer any of the questions that we didn't get to. Again, we've been collecting those from the Q&A, so we'll try to answer as many of those as possible. You can see here our social media handles. Feel free to follow us. You can keep up to date with the work that we've been doing. And again, just thank you for joining us. Your support is really what makes our work possible. So we really appreciate you being here today. We're also going to post a link in the chat if you want to donate to our climate campaign. We currently have a matching sponsor, so everything that anything that you donate will go twice as far. And I believe, I think that's about it for today. Again, thanks for joining, and everyone have a great afternoon.
Thank you.